오후 세션 처음은 기조강연 시작을 하겠습니다. 필립 칼드라고 유니버시티 오브 사우스 앰튼이라고 영국 잉글랜드의 교수님이신데 그 연사분에 대해서 잠시 소개를 드리겠습니다. 저는 안동대학교 식품영양학과의 권인숙입니다. 반갑습니다. 네. 그래서 다시 돌아가서 지금 한 20분간 기조 강연을 해주실 필립 칼도 교수님은 영국 옥스포드 대학에서 PhD를 따시고 영국 그 영양학에서 학회장을 하시고 오랫동안 의과대학에서 영양학을 하셔가지고 저희 건강하고 이런 관련 쪽에 연구를 많이 하셨습니다. 지금도 유럽에 가면은 그 한 30개 이상 국가들이 있는데 단독 학계를 가지기보다는 전체가 모여서 그 EU처럼 연합 영양학회가 있습니다. 거기에 지금 회장으로 하고 계시고요. 연구 분야는 오메가3로부터 시작을 해가지고 그 다이어트 식사하고 그 사람의 질병 건강에 관해서 쭉 연구를 해오셨습니다. 그래서 오늘 주제랑도 아주 맞는 부분이 많고요. 20분간 기조 강연을 하시고 그 다음에 이어서 전문가하고 잠시 연자분하고 짧게 토론하는 것이 있는데 그거 연이어서 보도록 하겠습니다. 그럼
Hello everybody. Thanks very much for involving me in your conference and congratulations to Jeonbuk on the 10th anniversary of its creation as a UNESCO Creative City of Gastronomy. I was asked to talk to you about the Mediterranean diet and the need for globalization and strategies for that globalization. In fact, most of my talk is going to be about the health impact of the Mediterranean diet, because I think we need to understand the health impact before we start to think about globalization and strategies for globalization. Coincidentally, the Mediterranean diet has also been recognized by UNESCO. In 2013, UNESCO placed the Mediterranean diet on its representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, meaning that the Mediterranean diet is key to the culture of humankind. What is the Mediterranean diet? Well, it's captured in these food pyramids, which show at the bottom of the pyramid the foods that should be consumed in large amounts, and at the top of the pyramid, the foods that should be consumed in small amounts, if at all. At the bottom of the pyramid, we see whole grain foods that should be consumed several times a day. We see the use of plant oils, and of course with the Mediterranean diet, we usually think of olive oil, but also other oils that bring mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids are part of the Mediterranean diet. We see heavy consumption of fruit and vegetables. We see nuts, legumes and seeds consumed several times daily. We see the frequent consumption of fish, poultry and eggs, and of low-fat dairy, yogurts and so on. And then we see the sparing consumption of red meat, animal fats like butter, and of white carbohydrate sources like white rice, white bread, white pasta, potatoes, and also of sugar-sweetened beverages and of sweets themselves. You'll also be aware that moderate alcohol consumption, particularly as red wine, is a component of the Mediterranean diet. And often these food pyramids also include the inclusion of daily exercise in the Mediterranean regimen as a way to bring the diet and weight control together. So regular daily exercise, moderate exercise usually, in combination with this healthy diet. Now we know the Mediterranean diet is healthy mainly because of association studies linking high consumption of the diet to reduce risk of chronic diseases of aging. This is a meta-analysis looking at the association between Mediterranean diet consumption and risk of heart disease, defined as development of coronary heart disease or having a heart attack. And what the data shows is that those individuals who have the greatest adherence to the Mediterranean diet, they have about a 30% lower risk of coronary heart disease compared to those individuals with low adherence to the Mediterranean diet. This favourable effect of the Mediterranean diet occurred equally in both men and women, occurred equally in both Mediterranean and non-Mediterranean regions, and occurred irrespective of the way the Mediterranean diet was scored. So the Mediterranean diet protects against heart disease This meta-analysis shows cardiovascular disease in general, so heart disease and stroke. Again, it shows that adherence to a Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease overall compared to low adherence to the Mediterranean diet. So those meta-analyses are based on association studies. They can't really demonstrate with certainty cause and effect. Thankfully, we have some randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet. And perhaps the most famous of these randomized controlled trials is the PREDIMED study. So PREDIMED was carried out in Spain. It involved 7,500 adults aged 55 to 80 years. 57% were women. These individuals were all at high cardiovascular risk, but they hadn't actually been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. They were divided into 3 treatment groups. 2 of those groups consumed the Mediterranean diet. One of them, a Mediterranean diet with significant amounts of extra virgin olive oil, and the other, a Mediterranean diet with regular consumption of nuts. The control group in PREDIMED consumed a low-fat diet. These individuals were followed for 4.8 years. So 3 groups, 2 of them with a form of the Mediterranean diet. The upper left shows the primary endpoint of PREDIMED, which was one of the following: acute myocardial infarction, stroke, or death from cardiovascular causes. The control group is shown in the darker line, and the 2 Mediterranean diets are shown in the coloured line. And you'll see both of the Mediterranean diets reduced the risk of this cardiovascular endpoint compared to the control group. So both Mediterranean diets were protective. On the bottom right is total mortality, and here you see the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil reduced risk of mortality from all causes across the study compared to the control group and the control group with nuts. So there's something special maybe about extra virgin olive oil as far as mortality outcomes is consumed. So both the association studies and the randomized controlled trial show that the Mediterranean diet reduces risk of cardiovascular disease. How can that be? Well, of course, the answer is that the Mediterranean diet creates a better risk factor profile. It lowers cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, lowers blood pressure, improves glucose control, and reduces inflammation, which I'm going to talk about later on. At the bottom of this slide is the results of a meta-analysis of 3 studies looking at glucose control, measured as hemoglobin A1C. And what this meta-analysis shows is that in randomized controlled trials, putting people onto the Mediterranean diet reduces hemoglobin A1C by 53% on average compared to the control group. So better glucose control here. Moving away from cardiovascular disease and thinking firstly about cancer and then about dementia, again I'll show you some meta-analysis forest plots. These are association studies looking at adherence to the Mediterranean diet and cancer mortality, showing that those who adhere more strongly to the Mediterranean diet have a lower risk of mortality from cancer. They have a reduced risk of colorectal cancer. This is seen in both case control and cohort studies and when they're aggregated together. They have a lower risk of gastric cancer, again in case control and cohort studies and when they're aggregated together. And women have a lower risk of breast cancer in case control studies and cohort studies. And interestingly, for breast cancer, there's also a randomized controlled trial which shows a 59% reduction in breast cancer in women at risk consuming the Mediterranean diet compared to the control diet. So the Mediterranean diet reduces risk of cancer, and people have tried to find out which components of the diet are responsible for that effect. And this is shown in this figure from one of those meta-analyses. So what's identified is that dairy, fruit, nuts, vegetables, and whole grains all reduce the risk of cancer independently of one another, with the greatest effect for whole grains. This is perhaps reflecting an effect on the gut microbiota and colorectal cancer risk, but maybe also on other types of cancer. Interestingly also, this moderate alcohol consumption was also protective against cancer. Moving on now to think about the Mediterranean diet, cognitive function, cognitive decline. Again, there are some meta-analyses of the studies in this area. This upper box shows a quote from this meta-analysis on Mediterranean diet and cognitive function and decline. So they included 32 studies that included 5 randomized controlled trials and 27 observational studies. They commented that the majority of studies showed that the Mediterranean diet was associated with improved cognitive function, decreased risk of cognitive impairment, and decreased risk of dementia. So again, mainly observational studies showing an inverse association with the Mediterranean diet being protective of cognitive function. Again, we have the randomized control Predimed study, and there have been some subgroup analyses of Predimed showing, 2 of them at least, showing that the Mediterranean diet plus extra virgin olive oil, those individuals maintained cognitive function better than the control group, and they had a slower onset of mild cognitive decline than the control group. So again, the randomized controlled trial suggesting cognitive benefit of the Mediterranean diet. One of the common risk factors in all of these conditions is inflammation. So we know inflammation underlies cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cognitive decline, and many cancers. Inflammation is also linked to loss of muscle mass with aging and immune decline with aging. So the Mediterranean diet protects against actually all of these things. I've talked about cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cognitive decline, and cancer. So maybe an anti-inflammatory effect of the Mediterranean diet explains these widespread health benefits. And in fact, again, there have been a lot of studies looking at the relationship between the Mediterranean diet and inflammation. And these cohort studies show that greater adherence to the Mediterranean diet is associated with less inflammation. Again, association studies have tried to identify which foods are responsible, and olive oil, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, fish and nuts have all been independently shown to relate to lower inflammation. So there's many food components of the Mediterranean diet that reduce inflammation. Again, we have data from Predimed, the intervention study, a subgroup of Predimed, 275 people in each of the 3 groups. 90% were overweight or obese, 50% were diabetic. The intervention period was 3 months of that 4.8 years of the Predimed study. 4 inflammatory markers looked at: CRP on the upper left, interleukin-6 on the upper right, ICAM-1 on the bottom left, and VCAM-1 on the bottom right. The 3 bars depict the 3 groups, and the data are changed from study entry. The open bar is the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil. The light grey bar is the Mediterranean diet with nuts, and the dark grey bar is the low-fat diet. So what you see is the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil decreased CRP, decreased interleukin-6, decreased ICAM-1, and decreased VCAM-1. The Mediterranean diet with nuts decreased interleukin-6, ICAM-1, and VCAM-1, and the low-fat diet didn't affect CRP or interleukin-6 and actually increased ICAM-1 and VCAM-1. So anyway, the Mediterranean diet seems to be an anti-inflammatory diet. Again, there have been several of these randomized controlled trials. This is a meta-analysis of the Mediterranean diet and inflammatory markers, and I'll just draw out for you the effects on C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, where there were 14 and 6 studies respectively, 2,000 and 1,000 individuals. The Mediterranean diet decreased both CRP and interleukin-6, and this was a statistically significant effect. So the anti-inflammatory effect could explain at least some of the effect of the Mediterranean diet on the chronic diseases of aging. Another possible core central mechanism is an impact on the gut microbiota. So as you know, diet is one of the main determinants of gut microbiota, and a healthy gut microbiota determines a healthy physiology, supports normal function, and resilience to challenge. And in turn, this controls disease risk factors and maintains health. So a healthy gut microbiota created by the Mediterranean diet could be acting to reduce the risk of the diseases I've been talking about. And of course, an adverse microbiota, what we call dysbiosis, means physiology and function are not normal. We lose resilience to challenge, risk factors go up, and we move away from health towards disease. Now, it turns out there are a lot of studies looking at the Mediterranean diet and the gut microbiota, and these have been summarized in this article here. Essentially, the Mediterranean diet promotes the growth of a number of organisms that are known to reduce inflammation and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, and obesity. So the Mediterranean diet is acting through the gut microbiota to promote health. Conversely, the Western diet decreases the abundance of those organisms, promotes the growth of other organisms that act to increase inflammation and increase the risk of cardiometabolic diseases. Of course, inflammation and gut microbiota are linked to one another, but certainly these seem to be two core mechanisms of action of the Mediterranean diet. So I sort of captured that in this figure from a review published a few years ago, where we have the Mediterranean diet, its food components that I've mentioned. Of course, those foods have specific nutrient components, health-promoting nutrients. These act to create a healthy gut microbiota, act to control inflammation, and in the end, what that means is we get promotion of health and well-being. And of course, as I mentioned, the microbiota and inflammation are interacting with one another. Of course, the Mediterranean diet is the diet described in countries around the Mediterranean Sea. Typically, we think of Spain, Italy, and Greece, but this diet also refers to southern France, some of the countries bordering the Adriatic Sea, like Croatia, for example, Turkey, some of the Middle Eastern countries that border the Mediterranean, and North African countries. So these countries all consume a form of the Mediterranean diet. It has some common characteristics across these countries, although there are, of course, some differences between the countries. But nevertheless, they all consume a type of the Mediterranean diet, which is healthy in the ways that I've mentioned. So the question is, can this diet be exported to other countries? Is globalization necessary? Is it practical? Well, maybe it's necessary because it's a health-promoting diet. And of course, other countries have problems with chronic diseases of aging, so the Mediterranean diet could help with that. Is it practical? Can it be done? Well, in fact, I think it's already happened and is happening. So these are the front pages of the dietary guidelines for Americans issued in 2010 and 2015. And you see the front covers are really depicting the Mediterranean diet. So in fact, the American guidelines really are based on the Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet has already been exported to North America. Now, whether it's taken up is another question, but at least as far as the guidelines are concerned, it's been exported. Likewise, here in the UK, we have our Eat Well guide. This is the Eat Well guide. Plenty of fruits and vegetables, plenty of nuts, seeds and pulses, low-fat dairy, and use of oils to provide unsaturated fatty acids. These are all common features of the Mediterranean diet. Here we see the carbohydrate-rich foods, we see brown bread, brown rice, foods with fibers and so on. Again, a key aspect of the Mediterranean diet with one or two little changes. For example, potatoes, which are not really part of the traditional Mediterranean diet. So we see, again, like in the US, in the UK, our dietary guidelines are actually based on the Mediterranean diet. So they have been exported. The other thing is there are some other diets, which are regional diets, which are very like the Mediterranean diet. So one of them is the Nordic diet in the Scandinavian countries. This is the recommended diet. This is based on traditional Nordic foods, but it's very similar to the Mediterranean diet. So this is one image of the Nordic diet that I found. So you see seeds, nuts, pulses, fruits and vegetables, unsaturated fatty acid containing vegetable oils, fish and so on, spices. One of the features of the Nordic diet is a lot of berries, because berries grow very well in Scandinavia in the summertime. But anyway, the Nordic diet is a little bit like a Scandinavian version of the Mediterranean diet. We have some randomized controlled trials of the Nordic diet. This is results from one of those trials showing the group consuming the Nordic diet, not the control group, but the group consuming the Nordic diet, showing that the Nordic diet reduces LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol, decreases insulin, decreases blood pressure, and lowers body weight. So just like the Mediterranean diet, the Nordic diet reduces cardiovascular risk. Another randomized controlled trial of the Nordic diet in blue, control group in red, showing reduction in LDL, elevation in HDL, and the control of inflammation. So just like the Mediterranean diet, the Nordic diet is modifying risk factors, maybe through inflammation, maybe through gut microbiota, to help control risk of chronic diseases. So I think there's evidence the Mediterranean diet has been globalized. It's the basis of dietary recommendations in North America and the UK. Just talked about the Nordic diet, which is a regional version of the Mediterranean diet, so Mediterranean diet with some changes. The question is, do you need to consider this? And I'm going to give two answers. So one is no, you don't, because the Korean diet has many of the characteristic features of the Mediterranean diet and other healthy diets, plus it includes fermented foods like kimchi for microbiota health. So the traditional Korean diet is very healthy. You don't need to worry about the Western diet then. On the other hand, the answer might be yes, because many young people might want to be, appear to be, they may want to be more westernized. I know the fast food outlets are very popular in Korea. Now, of course, the Mediterranean diet is superior to most other Western diet alternatives. So for people who want to be more westernized or appear to be more westernized, maybe steering them towards the Mediterranean diet is the way to go. And I think the lesson is from the Nordic diet to try to include foods that are locally available, foods people might be familiar with, foods that people will consume within any diet modification. So just to sum up, the Mediterranean diet is associated with lower risk of chronic disease. I talked about cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cancer, and cognitive decline. The foods within the Mediterranean diet contribute to its health-promoting effects. That's obvious. Many Western countries model their dietary recommendations on the Mediterranean diet. I talked about the US and UK recommendations. There are regional versions of the Mediterranean diet, like the Nordic diet, based upon traditional foods in those regions. And I think any switch in what you want people to do, you have to consider what foods are available and what foods people will consume. I think it's important to keep in mind the traditional Korean diet is also really healthy. And so Korea really only needs to consider the Mediterranean diet as a healthy alternative to other Western food patterns where those are patterns that people want to move towards. Just to finish up, if you want to read a little bit more about these things, Hellis Channer and I published this review in Nutrients in 2020, discussing the different types of dietary patterns that exist and how they link with health and disease. Thanks very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your conference.
The Mediterranean diet, we already know that that particular diet quite a bit have a big success in globalization. And the key factor of that, we think that is the health benefits of that particular diet, right? And I'm asking you, Professor Filicaldo, do you have any idea, any other factors or matters or aspects that particular diet have that high reputation in globalization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are some key things, I think, and one of them is when people travel to other places and they enjoy their time, part of that is the eating experience. And of course, the Mediterranean diet is actually a cultural experience. It's beyond just a diet. So I think the first thing is people traveling, and I'm thinking about this maybe in the European context, people traveling from Northern European countries to Mediterranean countries and enjoying the experience. And linked to that, of course, there are many cooking shows, particularly on television. So every night in the UK, we have at least one cooking show just on, on BBC or ITV. And a lot of the cooking is Mediterranean style. Of course, magazines are full of recipes about the Mediterranean diet. So I think we have, and also there are travel shows on TV, particularly in Northern Europe and to an extent in North America. So I think it's part of the culture, and I think all those things are linked together. But part of it in Northern Europe is people's experience from going on holiday to Mediterranean countries. So I think that's just how it is. It's just evolved over time through all those things coming together.
All right.
I